Chapter 4. The Philosophy of Regulations. Ideas not only have consequences, but they also have roots. They do not originate in a vacuum. Ideas and doctrines arise out of a realm of pre-theoretical presuppositions which represent the basic and underlying faith of a culture. As a result, if we deal with ideas only, without delving into the presuppositions which give rise to them, we are then skimming the surface and neglecting the essentials of the problem. Thus, in dealing with the philosophy of statist regulations, it is important to understand two separate things. First, there is the actual regulation and the justification for it. Thus, city planning and zoning laws are passed in order to provide for what is called orderly growth and to prevent undesirable and anarchic consequences. This rationale seems highly logical if we begin with the presupposition that the alternative to statist planning is anarchy. Obviously, the answer is that city planning is necessary only when we begin with the presupposition that city planning and true order are to be equated. If for us order lies elsewhere, we will turn elsewhere. This means, second, that basic to any critique of planning is a philosophy of regulations in planning. Do we need a master plan or planning? And if so, where do we locate the center of planning? And who is the planner? Our concern here is with this second and more basic question. Basic to any doctrine of regulations is a philosophy of order. What we believe to be ultimate order will determine our philosophy of regulations. It is important, therefore, to begin by glancing at one of the most influential books in world history, Plato's Republic. The influence of this book is, of course, not limited to classical antiquity. The Church and Christendom generally has, through the centuries, often and usually been more Platonic than biblical. Plato's Republic is a blueprint for a planned and totally regulated society. But the blueprint is less important to us in our present context than the reason for it. Greek thought was, on the whole, dialectic. It believed that the world was made up of two alien substances held together only by dialectical tension. One of these substances was matter. The realm of matter is meaningless, lawless, and purposeless. As a result, the realm of matter can take shape only if the second substance, form, mind, pattern, or idea was brought to bear upon it to control and regulate it. This view is, outside the biblical faith, common to all antiquity and most of history, although with variations. Thus, in Iranian thought, instead of two substances existing in dialectical tension, they are separate and in conflict. In the philosophies of India, the problems of dialectical tension led to a collapse into monism. The one substance, matter, was reduced to illusion. Only mind is real, and the goal of mind is therefore an escape from the world of illusion. In a more extreme form, both mind and body were seen as illusions, and the result was a longing for escape from illusions into nothingness. In the Western tradition, the dialectical version has predominated. In its first form, it was the dialectic of idea and matter. In the second, as H. Dewey has pointed out, it was the medieval dialectic of grace and nature. And finally, in the modern form, freedom and nature. In the medieval form, grace collapsed and nature became the governing factor, and in the modern view, freedom is becoming an illusion and nature the reality. Moreover, in the modern view, freedom really means the idea or plan of autonomous man. With this in mind, Hellenic society becomes understandable. A handful of free men ruled over a large number of lesser men and slaves. The ratio could be 10 ruled for one ruler, or much higher. The common people and slaves are part of the world of matter. The quote-unquote free men were men of ideas, men who represented the autonomy of mind from external and material conditions. They were, ideally, Socratic and ivory tower thinkers, representing in purity the idea or pattern as devised by the mind of autonomous man. They were philosopher kings, whose duty it was to rule other men. Not surprisingly, the pupils of Plato were the 30 tyrants of Greece. Whether in Sparta or in Athens, the faith in the regulatory power and necessity of the idea, pattern, or plan was basic. Human society, rational society, meant the rule of the idea or plan, and therefore of the planning men and thinkers, the men of ideas. Critics of the early church have called it a collection of slaves and the dregs of society, a charge made repeatedly over the centuries. The church might have been stronger in some respects had this been so. In actuality, numerous bureaucrats, government officials, lawyers, and especially philosophers joined the new faith. They brought with them the form-matter dialectic and a belief in the necessity for the regulation of all things by means of the idea. Throughout the medieval era, the attempt of men was to implement the rule of the idea either through the Holy Roman Empire or through the papacy. While neither attempt can be reduced to pure Hellenism, all the same, Hellenism was basic to much of the struggle. Implicit in Platonism and clearer in Neoplatonism was a faith in the purity of the idea, pattern, or form. To the extent that man's mind separated itself into the life of reason or spirit, to that extent it partook of that purity. Aristotle had held to the concept of the mind as a pure blank tablet, hence without sin or prejudicial disposition. Thomas Aquinas made this concept basic to his philosophy, as did John Locke later. This meant that the man of reason, the philosopher king, could, in an ivory tower kind of thinking, establish a plan of pure reason which could best regulate mankind. The world of matter, the physical world apart from mind, being an orderless and meaningless world, regulation and control by ideas or reason was seen as a necessity. Not surprisingly, the renewed emphasis on Plato in the so-called Renaissance, not so named until after the French Revolution, circa 1815, led to a renewal of centralization and control to regulation by the tyrant states of the era. The world of Bishop Oreme, whose theology led him to remove regulation from man and place it in the nature of things, was forgotten. With Calvin, a limited measure of deregulation set in. Weber and others have overstressed the extent of the practical break, but understand the philosophical break. What Calvin did was to remove the power of regulation from the realm of mind and idea, and thus from philosopher kings, and place it in God and God's law. His application was far from thorough, but his principle placed regulatory law in God's hands, not man's. The Puritan tradition in Britain developed this implication. It was a radical implication and only slowly developed. It meant simply a trust in the invisible hand of God rather than the visible hand of the state and its planners as the true source of regulation. It is ironic that this development climaxed in Adam Smith's statement of the case for regulation by the invisible hand precisely when belief in that invisible hand was collapsing. Every other aspect of the 18th century doctrine of deregulation rested on the premise of the invisible hand, a belief that the very nature of things was in conformity to the laws of the invisible hand. The evangelical revival in Britain gave, in the 19th century, a continuing vitality to that doctrine, whereas after Darwin, the collapse of the creationist faith led to the search by churchmen for a new source of regulation in the social conscience of the body public. At that point, Marx and Engels were more perceptive than most men of their day. They immediately recognized the radical and basic contribution made by Darwin to their faith. Darwin had reduced the universe to a realm of chance, to brute and meaningless factuality. A brute fact is a meaningless, purposeless, mindless, and unintelligent fact. For Darwin, the universe is simply a vast collection of brute factuality. There is no mind, no law in it, behind it, or beyond it. This being the case, as Marx saw, there can be only one source of law and regulation from the mind of man. For him, the dialectical process provided the answer. The dictatorship of the proletariats is the infallible idea in history, bringing order to a world in disorder. The inner logic of this position carried men into socialism. John Stuart Mill began as a libertarian and ended as a socialist. In this, he was more logical than later libertarians, since there was no longer any ground in science for a belief in an invisible hand. A new source of order and regulation had to be posited. The logical source was the state. The Fabian Society was one consequence of such conclusions by the intellectuals of the day. Since then, of course, men have been more persuaded of the brute nature of factuality. The universe is not only seen as mindless, but it is questioned as a unity. Clark Kerr held that we have in reality a multiverse, and the university thus had to become a multiversity. The older concept of the university was a uniquely Christian concept and a product of Christendom. It rested on the premise of one God, one law, one universe of truth and meaning. Now the idea of good and evil, right and wrong was denied. The doctrine of absolute truth and a universe of total meaning was dismissed. This has meant that the new realm of meaning is man, and therefore man's agency, the state. Absoluteness, having been denied to God and his truth, was transferred to the state, and the result is totalitarianism. The attributes of God have become the attributes of the modern state. The idea governs and regulates absolutely, and its name is statist man. Until truth and law are again located in the sovereign God of Scripture, and all regulation and predestination ascribed to God and his laws for men, until then we will continue to have the totalitarian regulatory state. We'll have predestination by state planners and cradle-to-grave or womb-to-tomb governments by the new hand of quote-unquote providence, a statist agency. Men act out their faith in history, and historical problems are enactments of faulty and erroneous faiths. To clean up a society, we must clean up its presuppositions. This clearly is a religious task.